to read the minutes. Mike, you sure had. May I have a motion to approve the minutes as are, or is there any need for changes?
I'll approve them.
Second. Thank you. So minutes approved and moved as are. Oh, hello.
Perfect.
Do you need the computer to give us? No? Okay. Well, are you okay to jump right into your presentation? Okay. So Gurdeep is here, so he's going to talk to us about his equity presentation.
Great. Good morning. And I think everyone's probably met me or had the poor circumstances to have met me at some point, and I'm teasing. So thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak. And I guess my first question is, was everyone able to complete the online module? Was there an online module that was circulated?
I'm getting the sound.
Okay. If you're giving me blank looks, I'll explain what that was. Okay. So what we've started an online module to basically do what I'm doing now. It's that scary thing about being replaced by a robot. And so what we've done is we've actually tried to streamline. Sorry. Can you hear me now? Is that any better?
I can hear you perfectly.
Megan, you can hear me?
I can hear you perfectly, yes.
Okay. Who was it that can? Blake, was that you? Or Don?
Oh, no, that's right.
I'm just doing a sound check. Can everyone hear me all right? How about a thumbs up if you can hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Don, can you hear me all right? Might have been Don. Good morning. Don, how's your audio? I think Don might be the one.
What? Can't hear anything.
Yeah, I think Don might be. Don, can you hear us? Oh, he's calling in. We'll just give Don a couple of seconds.
Please enter the number you wish to connect to, followed by the pound key.
It's interesting, we can hear Don, but I guess he can't hear us.
Welcome to the conference.
So, Don, can you hear us?
I can hear you now. I couldn't with just the video, so I'm going to
Yeah, no worries. Just mute your audio on your computer, I think.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. So, Don, are you okay now?
Yeah, I'm good.
Oh, great. I'm hoping that's everyone that can hear me now. So what I was in the process of explaining really briefly is that we're trying to take this equity talk that I'm about to give you next, and it's not really a whole talk; it's about 5-10 minutes tops. But we've moved to trying to create it, to move it into an online module. So it has been created. There's a bit of a soft launch that we're in the process of now. That's why I asked you whether any of you had done it yet. So it hasn't been rolled out for this particular search, but you'll see it come up in more and more searches as we go around. And so just a few things that I always say is that, and I apologize for those that have heard this already before, is that there isn't anything specific or unique that we're targeting in this search that is the reason that I'm here and why I'm making these comments. So what we're doing now is we're saying that this is sort of standard best practice across not just faculty of medicine, but across campus and in all the faculties, that to be doing a little bit of a talk like this, so we're thinking in the right direction. And if I hadn't been available to do this, I'm looking around the room, Don could have done it, or Mike, or we could have brought in Deborah Money or Mike Allard, that you all know well, or even Dermot himself. So it is something that we're all trying to sort of pass on. My comments are going to fall into four areas. The first one has to do with what your main objective is, I believe. And your main objective in a search like this is basically identifying excellence. So it's identifying who is the absolutely best candidate. The only thing that I ask you to do as you're determining that is to have a discussion around the metrics for excellence. And in a lot of academic positions, you would think what I'm saying is relatively straightforward. We're talking about grants and publications and the impacts of those grants and publications. We're often talking about teaching evaluations or the scholarship of education. But also, and again, I'm looking at people like Dawn and Mike and others around the room who've been in various tough leadership positions where I'd like you to also think about some of the other metrics around excellence, which is also that, we used to call it soft skills, and I won't insult it by calling it that anymore, but the ability to cooperate, the ability to problem solve, the ability to be a good mentor, the ability to resolve conflict when it arises. So perhaps think about those types of things and, what is somebody's work habit and what is their sort of pattern of interacting with others. So I think the first thing to do when you're looking at the candidates or shortlisting them, where are we in the process right now? Have we?
We've just received pre-interview rankings.
Oh, okay. So looking at those rankings and then saying, so how did we arrive at these and what metrics are we applying? So probably a good discussion. And obviously, things aren't always ideal. Probably would have been better to even have that 2 or 3 sort of steps ago, but that's all right, even having that discussion now. The second bit is probably the thrust of what I'm trying to emphasize here is the concept around diversity. Being a public institution and being the only sort of faculty of medicine in the province, we don't have the luxury of carving off part of the province or part of a jurisdiction like they do in Alberta, where they sort of divide into north and south, or parts of Ontario that focus on geographical parts. So we have a sort of social responsibility to be meeting the needs of all British Columbians, and you could extrapolate that to Canada and to the world. But that also means that we have a responsibility to have our students, staff, and faculty members as much as possible match the demographics of the province. So if I can just digress a little bit, is that when we're thinking about trainees, we're kind of getting there. So if you think of just even medical students and residents, our makeup is, in terms of gender equity, is there. In fact, most of our classes have more women than men. In terms of our ethnic breakdown for our medical students, it's actually matching, if not exceeding, the provincial sort of ethnic diversity. I would say where we're underrepresented when it comes to our medical students is still Indigenous students, although we have a great admissions program that's supporting the successes there. And then lower socioeconomic class is something we're trying to tackle. And the other one around there, people with disabilities. And that's always a challenge because of especially invisible disabilities, people often don't self-declare. So I think for a lot of our, I just chose medicine as an example because it's sort of the largest one, but I could say the same for a lot of our other programs. And some of the programs like PT, midwifery, and OT are overrepresented when it comes to women. So and I could say similarly with our master's and PhD programs. But where I think we've fallen really short, and when I started thinking about this about 15 years ago, we always thought the pipeline effect was going to work. So when I graduated medical school in 92, we thought because in our class there were more women than men, all that would mean is that down the road there'd be more women clinicians, then more women academic leaders, more women researchers, and more women department chairs and research center directors and so forth. Well, that didn't happen. So 15 years ago, this whole pipeline effect is what we called it. The pipeline didn't work. And so using the same metaphor, what we're saying across North America is that pipeline was either leaky, plugged, whatever you want to say to that pipeline, it didn't work. And so now we're thinking, well, what else needs to be done? And I don't believe in, and I don't think anybody's going to use the term affirmative action. So we're not saying to put underrepresented candidates ahead of others. What we're asking you to do is remove the obstacles in recognizing the first theme which I brought, which is excellence. So, for example, if you're looking at 2 candidates and there's a male candidate and a female candidate, and you see that the female candidate is perhaps for a certain period of time a little less productive, or the grants aren't as big, or the teaching commitment hasn't been as large as the male candidate, make sure you drill down a bit to see what could have possibly influenced that. Was there family leave? Was there maternity leave? Was there paternity leave? Likewise with a male candidate. So if a male candidate took a paternity leave or family leave, make sure you correct for those when you're comparing the candidates so you can see them on an equal footing. There's lots of research out there now, and I won't bore you with this, but there's lots of research out there that says that when a female and a male trainee, for example, ask me for a reference letter, I will use different adjectives and different adverbs to describe a male candidate than I will a female candidate. When I'm reviewing CVs and applications, I will actually see them through different lenses, what we call our subconscious or our unconscious bias. And that's not to say that we're sexist or that we're mean or bad people. It just means that a lot of us have some biases, and we all have some biases that we carry around. But the most important thing is to actually address those biases and put them up front and tackle them. The other part around that is around ethnic biases, and there's a lot of probably more work done in the U.S. than in Canada, and there's a lot out there, and a lot of their work focuses on Black Americans or African Americans and Latino Americans and so forth. And there's studies out there that'll show, for example, there's a character in the a video game was a character in the distance, and the character's reaching down into their inside jacket pocket, and the whole idea with the video game is if they pull out a gun and you haven't shot them by hitting the space key, then you're dead. However, if you shoot them before they pull out the gun, then you win. Now, what's interesting is that this figure's in the distance, and you can barely make out what they're pulling out of their jacket. So if they pull out a cell phone and you shot them, and then you've killed basically an innocent person. But if you waited too long and they pulled out a gun, you're dead. So then they complicate the game a bit by having the person in the distance who's barely visible look like either an African American or white American. And a lot of the people who would go through this, and you can play the game yourself, is a bit disturbing because you're probably majority of people more likely to shoot the African American. So all to say that, whether it's media, whether it's the biases we grew up with, whatever the explanation is that we often carry that around. To bring that more real to our selection process, there have been studies even in the lay press, which, the one that was published that I think stunned a lot of people was they took the exact same CV and they sent it to hiring agencies. And one had a Chinese name and another one had sort of an Anglo-Saxon white name. And they sent it out to hiring companies to see who would get an interview. And the one with the white-sounding name got more invitations for an interview. So often when I'm raising examples like that, people will say, oh, yeah, Gurdeep, but we're looking for Canadian experience. These two CVs were exactly the same. So there was the exact same education and the exact same work experience. Or likewise, studies that have asked people to evaluate communication skills. So it's the same audio clip going, but people of different ethnicities lip syncing, and you're asked to grade them. It's inevitable that, not inevitable, but for a lot of times the white candidate will be scored higher for communication skill, even though it's the same audio clip that's going. All to say that we have biases, and just recognize your own and think about what you need to do to make the applicant pool and then your selection process as inclusive as possible. Now, sometimes what that means, and I appreciate you're at the point where you're shortlisting candidates to interview, but sometimes it means even taking a step back and saying, was our applicant pool diverse enough? Were we happy with the applicant pool? Or now that we've got the applicant pool, are the shortlisted candidates diverse enough? And I'll have to admit that even I've been caught in this where, we've got the applicant pool really, really diverse, and then we're looking at the shortlist that we're going to interview, and they look like they all come from some homogenous group. And even people push back and said, Gurdeep, why did we interview, for example, just white males, and was there not a female candidate we wanted to interview, or a person who belonged to another underrepresented group, Indigenous or otherwise? And I'll tell you, almost without exception, when we put an underrepresented candidate into a shortlisted pool, it actually is good for the entire process. One is that the person coming through the process then gets some confidence, and they may not get this position, but gives them confidence for another one. But you might just be surprised about how well they do. So there's something to think about. And what we're finding now, and this is strictly anecdotal, is where the diversity seems to drop off is at that process where we're going from shortlist to ranking the final candidates, or from the applicants to the shortlisting. So there's something to think about. So we talked about the excellence and metrics for excellence. We talked about diversity. The next component is around conflict of interest. And again, you might think this is relatively obvious, but just to remind you that declaring a conflict of interest is really, really important. And they generally fall into two categories. One is you've worked with the candidate before, or you've taught with them before, or you've presented with them before, you've been on a grant with them before. And actually, I think that's really good information. I think the selection committee would benefit from your first-hand knowledge of what this individual is like. And generally what I say is have a very low threshold for reporting it, and then have the chair prerogative to decide whether or not you're going to continue in the selection committee and on the selection process. Just from my experience, I can tell you that the majority of people who declare those end up staying involved. There might be some work relationship that is too close, and the person has to be excused to participating. What we don't want, and this has happened before, is that we get to the point of ranking, and then it comes out that somebody had been somebody else's fellow or been on a publication with someone. Now you might think, how could that possibly happen? We have their CVs, and how could you not have noticed that? Believe it or not, it happens. And sometimes it may not be something that gets identified on a CV or an application. The other area of conflict of interest is where it's not that you've had a work relationship with one of the candidates, but you've had a different type of relationship. So either they're your neighbor, they're your sister's friend, your kids swim together, that type of thing where it's more of a social or personal context. And even that low threshold for reporting it, that's a bit trickier in terms of how valuable that information might be. But I think what's most important is if you're allowed to continue in the selection process and being on this committee, is that everyone else in the committee should know that when Gurdeep is saying this, is he being totally objective, or is it because he's neighbors with one of the candidates? What's important is that the rest of the group should know the context in which you're speaking. So it's, again, best to share that information. The last one, so again, excellence. We talked about diversity, conflict of interest, and the last one is confidentiality. And I apologize if you've covered this before with this committee, but I often joke that there's a lot of rules at the university we tend to bend or twist, but that's one that we don't. And one of the issues around selection processes is that we want you to be as candid as possible about all the candidates, and no positive or negative comments should ever reach any of the candidates. And again, you might think I'm stating the obvious, but I can't tell you how many times we've fallen on this one. And it might be something as subtle as running into somebody a day or two after the interview and being in the elevator and saying, oh, that was good. I really enjoyed that. Or, you did a great job, or even a wink or a thumbs up or something. And even that's too much. So I would suggest respectfully that best practice is no communication with any of the candidates other than through the chair of the selection process committee or through their designated administrator, just so that there's a tight control on the information that goes back to the candidates. As Mike, come on in. Oh, that was amazing. I thought you were just on the screen. He's everywhere. So I'll pause there, partly to inhale. And as Mike knows, I also work as an auctioneer in the evening, so I speak very fast. This medicine gig never paid enough. But are there any questions about anything I've said? If not, I'll. Megan, were you saying something?
Yeah, sorry, I had myself on mute. I was just wondering, being on the research committees now, and exactly what you said, we have a diverse pool of people applying, but when it comes to the ranked shortlist, they're all white men. Mm-hmm. So at what point do we feel compelled to go back and repost the ads?
Excellent question, and I'm not going to have an excellent answer, but I'm going to try. So I think that's something you all have to collectively decide. There are sometimes positions that have such a small, narrow niche of sort of expertise, and you know who's who out there, and then you say, you know what, I don't know if we're going to get any more diverse in this very specific area. Other times people say, if we're shortlisting and they're all, for example, not a diverse group that we're going to be interviewing, do we need to go back to the applicant pool and look at it and try to get more people to apply? The data out there right now, and I'm not a social scientist, although I pretend to be, but I'm not a social scientist, but people will tell you that the underrepresented groups, especially women, need the tap on the shoulder. So I spend a good part of my waking day recommending to especially junior female colleagues in the Faculty of Medicine to apply for positions. So there may be, for example, women candidates that are in North America or somewhere else that is your sort of target audience that just haven't had the tap on the shoulder, haven't been encouraged to apply. And that might be something you all collectively do. So Megan, it's a great question. I think it's really it's really situation by situation. And if you think that the process now to go to the next level and isn't diverse enough, then it might be a point to pause and go back to your applicant pool and see if there are other applicants that you haven't been able to connect with. That's a good discussion to have. And like I said, it really depends on the specific criteria and qualifications that you're looking for. I would suggest to you, I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb here, a lot of organizations, and it's not just universities, we're talking hospitals, I'm on the board of the College of Physicians and Surgeons, any institution that has a tradition and history is struggling with this right now. And some have become really bold. And as much as I came into this kind of activity resisting things like quotas, and I don't even like the term affirmative action, I hate to say this, but sometimes the quotas work. And what I mean by that is, so some organizations have said, for every overrepresented candidate that we're interviewing, we're going to have one underrepresented candidate that we're going to interview. So that some organizations have taken that bold of a statement or stance. I'm not suggesting that we're there in the Faculty of Medicine, but it really depends how hard you want to push this. Oh, sorry, I've got my...
Oh, thank you. Any other questions?
No, I'm all good. I'm not too far away. So if you need me to come back, you just turn off for just a sec. If you need me to come back to clarify any of this, or through the chair, if you have any question you want to email me, happy to answer that. Otherwise, I'll excuse myself and leave you with the complete confidence that you're going to make the right decision. No pressure, no pressure.
Thanks, Gertie.
Thank you very much. That was great. All right. Sorry, Adeline, before you came, we established that we had quorum with 6 members present. Blake has since moved from telecommunication to be here in person. He gets the record from moving fastest from the UBC cancer agency over here. And we moved and approved the minutes from last time. So with Gurdeep's, yes?
I had just sent to Adeline a couple of literally minor changes in the minutes.
Thank you very much. Are they syntax? They don't need to be brought forward to the committee again? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for bringing that forward. I still accept them as being moved then. So the next point on the agenda is the approval of the finalized terms of references. So again, you should have all had them and had a look at them, hopefully. Point out 2 things. Again, quorum is 6 out of 8 voting members. Remind you, I as the chair and Don Brooks as department head do not have voting rights. But we do have 6 people present right now. Monica is not present right now, and we're missing one more, right? Tom. And then the other thing is the criteria for the position. So as you know, you've been through the ranking, and thank you very much for doing that. And we've also highlighted them again within the terms of reference. And following on what Gurdeep was saying is the evidence of medical competence and the potential for transformation in the department. And I know that's a big statement, but I think looking through the rankings, that was quite apparent within the CVs, and I think you were able to capture that. And the evidence that they can collaborate, this is, as was mentioned, a very small niche that we are hiring for, and so we need somebody who's able to work within collaboration with multiple stakeholders, and then the evidence for the potential to effectively work with diverse groups, stakeholders as well as learners. Have the potential to supervise and teach students and residents, and then have a productive research and the potential to be an agent of change when it comes to research in that area. So those were all criteria and then terms of reference. So may I have a motion from the committee to accept these terms of reference? A second. Thank you very much. So we accept the terms of reference as they are. All right, so the next 2 items we'll combine because I think as we now discuss shortlisting candidates, first off, I think discrepancies, this is a very open and not afraid to talk group. So I'm not afraid that you speak your mind. If, however, you feel that during the committee you didn't get a chance or somebody didn't really accept your viewpoint, I'm very happy to receive any kind of communication after the meeting, and I'm happy to consider it and bring that forward. So don't feel afraid to reach out in that regard. On that point, I've already received, and Adeline and I have received some of you with your conflict of interest. And so I think at this point, as we look at the candidates that we are ranking, and we will go back to that in a second, it'd be good if we go around the room and everybody has a chance to declare their conflict of interest with any of the candidates, and we as a committee will make a decision as to how we value this conflict of interest, or whether this would be at a point where we think this committee member may not be in a position to participate in the ranking process. I'll start it off. Mike, do you have any conflict of interest you want to declare?
Just with respect to Peter Van den Elzen, I've worked with him, and he seeks my advice, so I would feel I have a conflict.
Okay, thank you. I think you indicated that you might know Dr. Long. No? Okay, good. Thank you. Paul?
Yeah.
I had mentioned that I know James Lan through his training in nephrology, and James is currently funded by BCTS as in a link position called clinical consultant between the solid organ transplant programs and the immunology lab. Apart from that, the only other one I know is Peter van den Eten, but I only know him through cursory meetings. I have no real association.
No conflicts, professional interactions.
Megan?
Yeah, I had declared a conflict with Peter van den Elsen. Obviously, he's a colleague at BC Children's Hospital Research Institute, and I interact with him on a fairly regular basis.
Thank you. And Dr. Landsberg?
Yeah, so I have a conflict with James on, I guess, a couple of levels. In that, one, he was a trainee. I've been his mentor throughout his career. I've been a mentor, and I'm the medical director of BC Transplant, and so I've the position that he now has in the immunology lab is a position through BC Transplant, which I facilitated. But maybe more importantly, also we have a division-wide practice plan for nephrology, and it's an actual formal partnership. And James is a partner in this, as am I.
Thank you. So I think to summarize, so there are members of this committee, two with Paul and David, who have worked quite closely with Dr. Lan. As the chair, I've reflected upon this prior to coming into this meeting. I think it's good to remind all of us that this is a faculty of medicine position. And there are certainly members applying to this who have a combined role with a medical profession. I personally don't think that at this point these conflict of interest would preclude the members from participating in that. But I've seen that all of you have taken the liberty of not ranking those candidates. And as we will go through in the ranks right now, irrespective thereof, it's still panned out quite nicely. So I think at this point, I would put forward to the committee that we accept that you have put forward your conflict of interest. We bear them in mind as we move through the process, but I do not feel strongly that any of the conflict of interest declared would lead to me considering asking for replacement of a committee member. Any discussions on those points?
It's Tom Blood-Hansen. I'm actually on the call.
Perfect.
I also have, I think it's a minor conflict with James. I work with James, and we are going to be co-supervising a summer student, and we're colleagues, but there's no power dynamic between the two of us.
Thank you. Any comments, questions, suggestions? All right. With that, are you able to put that list up? I'm sorry for those of you on the line. We're just Adeline is just trying to put the combined ranking list up. Do people have it? Blake, you have it on your computer? Do you guys on the line, do you have it in front of you?
No, I don't. I can't.
The combined version? I think it's in the latest email that Adeline sent out. It's an Excel spreadsheet, colorful.
Well, that helps.
Okay. Not working? Oh, I have it on my phone. I don't like paper.
I've got it on my screen now.
You
So
have it?
Out for the emails.
Megan, do you have it? Yeah, Megan has
I
it.
have it on my screen. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I have it.
Okay. So I think the majority of you have it. So I think, so as you are all quite aware, we have 8 candidates, and you all provided scores based on the criteria provided, and we asked you to rank them. And so maybe I first draw your attention to the very end of that list, which is the average scores. And so lowest score was 10.3, high score was 38.3. And maybe to shorten the process and not looking actually at the names, I would propose that we would not consider anybody for an interview that has a score of less than 20. So that would take out 3 candidates right away. And then in the 20 range, there were 3. The lowest one was 23.6, which was candidate number 7, was not ranked by anybody. So I would propose to remove that candidate as well. The next one is candidate number 2, 25.4. Again, did not receive any ranking. So I would propose to maybe not shortlist this person. So that leaves us then with a candidate of 26.8, position number 8, which is still 12 points or 11.2 points out from the next candidates. So I think just looking at average scores and not looking at the names, the 2 top candidates are in all likelihood, based on committee's feedback, the ones we would like to interview. And then the question is what to do about candidate number 8, who comes in at 26.8. 2 members abstained from ranking. If you look in the summary comments to your right, and then 2 committee members actually wish to interview him. Are there any strong feelings on that proposal, Paul?
This particular candidate has neither of the qualifications that I think would be essential. There is no formal laboratory training in histocompatibility, and there is no formal training in transplantation. There is a background in immunology, but it's not particularly the form of immunology we need for the lab. So if this candidate was selected, they would need to go through formal 2-year ASHI training program, receive their accreditation, and also demonstrate in some way that they can link with the clinical teams, which normally requires a much longer training program. So I think even though there may be, this candidate certainly has some strengths, it's not strengths which are relevant to the position in the lab.
Thank you. So happy to hear any other thoughts on that. So as you know, this is Peter Van Elsen, who is known to many members on the committee. To remind everybody, ASHI certification was not a requirement, but an asset for this position, as was medical knowledge within transplantation. So I do wanted to make those points that not having that does not disqualify the candidate per se from that position.
Although I think formal training in histocompatibility was.
It's an asset considered, but not a total requirement.
No, in the job description it says applicants must hold an MD and have full postdoctoral training in laboratory immunology.
Yeah, that is correct. But we're talking about specifically ASHI certification. And ASHI certification, if we read the job correction, was considered to be an asset, but not a requirement.
Sure. So I guess that one of the things I struggled with going through this list was that it appeared that some of the candidates didn't actually meet that a priori requirement for application. It was sometimes a little difficult to tell from their CVs whether that was true or not, and I guess that's an initial test that needs to be met to determine whether we should be considering some candidates at all.
I know it's a fair question. Adeline, correct me if I'm wrong. We initially had 14 candidates, and we actually disqualified those who didn't even meet those criteria based on cursory or initial review. So the ones that were presented to you, to the best of our understanding, had an MD as well as some postdoctoral training in immunology.
Just if I could speak to being one of the people that suggested an interview for Dr. Van den Elzen, you can see my ranking. I agree with everything Paul said. I don't think he's a credible candidate for this position given some of the applicants we have. But as a colleague in the department, it's an opportunity to offer constructive feedback and criticism. I think there's things that could have been improved in his application. An interview probably is not wholly appropriate, but maybe the committee chair, I would be happy to meet with him. I think some encouragement and that knowing that we took it seriously, just as a way of helping and being collegial is all I'm really suggesting here.
And I think that's a very fair statement. In my clinical role, I've met with Peter, and I think he's quite aware of where he currently stands in his transition of his career at this point. But I think definitely I'm happy as chair to reach out to him and give feedback. But I'm still happy to hear any other opinions as to whether we should extend an offer to interview to him.
So if he
go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, I guess I would feel uncomfortable not interviewing him if he's fully met the mandatory criteria. So Paul's point that he's not ASHI certified, that wasn't a mandatory qualification, and that he's not trained in transplant immunology, if I understood correctly, that's also not a mandatory qualification. So just in terms of the process and being true to the job description, I would feel, we should discuss the application based on the criteria that's listed below here and make a decision whether or not to interview him on the basis of what those criteria are, rather than things that were assets, not mandatory things.
No, absolutely, and I agree with you. My only comment back to that would be is the difference in the average score, and irrespective of him meeting the mandatory requirements, his score was significantly lower than the top two ranked candidates.
Although we have to, three people did not give a score. So myself, Dr. Nemo, and so it's
no, absolutely. And then there's two ways of looking at it, right? We can offer an interview to him based on him meeting all the criteria. Then we have to ask ourselves, well, then what about the fourth ranked candidate, which comes in only moderately lower in his score? Should we offer an interview to him as well? Or are we offering an interview because Peter is a member of this department and we feel compelled to give him the opportunity? I'm opening this up for discussion because I think this is one of the important points that the committee has to decide upon.
It's Tom again. I'm among the people who believes we should interview Peter.
Sorry, we can't hear you, Tom. Do you mind speaking up?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I do think we probably should be offering Peter an interview, but again, I go back to the question, several of these candidates, I was not sure that they met the basic criteria of having postdoctoral training in laboratory immunology. And for me, it's obviously important that we're meeting the minimum criteria for the applicants. And I think this is an issue in particular with some of the candidates that were ranked below Peter. I wasn't entirely clear that they actually met those criteria, not talking about ASHI certification. So, but I don't feel like I'm the best person, since I'm not a laboratory immunologist, to say whether their training meets those criteria. And I'm wondering if there's some question of, well, if we interview someone with a 26, do we do a 25 and a 23? It's important for me to understand whether those others actually met those minimum criteria, because my impression was that some did not.
Yeah, fair comment. Paul?
I think one thing you got to think about is if we just were to limit ourselves to and I can't vote, so I'm just commenting, but if we limit them to the two top people and they both, for whatever reason, turn us down, what do we do? Do we go out? Do we have a third position? And secondly, I spent a lot of time with Peter as well, just trying to help him in his transition and so on. And I think he'd be happy to have a discussion with the chair and maybe myself even, or one or two of the committee members, without having don't call it an interview, just call it a discussion. I think he'd be okay with that. But I do accept the argument, but then, why are we not interviewing number 25.4 or having a discussion with that person as well and so on? So, I don't know. Anyway, those are my comments.
Tom, I can respond to your question in that we have a very mixed group. Some of them have no training in the field of immunology at all. Some have a little. Some are in process. Peter has extensive training in immunology, but not transplantation immunology. I have no particular feeling whether it's a good idea or not a good idea to offer him an interview, only that if he were considered as a serious candidate, he would then have to start training formally for this position.
Okay. So, Paul, can you shed light then, and particularly on the question raised, candidate number 2 and candidate number 7, who are in their ranks close to Peter? Do they have the same amount of training for transplant immunology?
With pleasure. And in starting off, I should say, as I mentioned before, that I know James Lan fairly well, and so please take everything I say with that in context. But we're lucky that we have two really excellent candidates, both similar in background, but with slight differences. So James is trained both formally in clinical transplantation, has completed his ASHI training, completed his AST, American Society of Transplantation, training in clinical transplantation, is a member of the clinical renal transplant team here, works under David, is affiliated with the BC Transplant, and is collaborating with the other solid organ teams in providing immunological support to them. Is highly regarded by all of them there. He also completed his formal training in histocompatibility and immunogenetics at UCLA with Elaine Reed, who is one of the perhaps top 5 or 10 senior individuals in the world and highly regarded as such. And since coming back has been working in a link position I described, which is recognized by ASHI as a clinical consultant, being an individual working in a clinical team who has substantial formal training in the laboratory and provides immunological support to the clinical team. James is still young. He's only been, I think, in practice for a year or so, but is already proving himself to be a superb individual, extremely industrious, hardworking, communicative, very research-oriented. I think is bound to be a star of the future. Whether he was here or somewhere else, I think he would rate very highly. And Gerald Morris is a similar kind of individual, a little bit older, graduated a little bit earlier, did his initial training at Wayne State, then moved to Washington University, where he trained with Paul Allen and Mohammed Kumar. He is fully trained in laboratory immunology in terms of transplantation, is ASHI accredited, and took over in 2017 as the director of the HLA laboratory at the University of California at Irvine. He is obviously very much research-oriented, also has a list of publications which you'll see there. is this sort of strong, enthusiastic, research-oriented director of a laboratory, which I think UBC would welcome. So either of those two candidates are really superb, slightly different backgrounds, slightly different current skills, but both very strong, and I think are really the only two candidates that I would seriously consider from this field. The others have important deficiencies in one way or another. So I'll stop.
Okay. Any other comments? So I guess based on ranking as well as Paul's assessment of the situation, I think let's first off maybe put to the committee that we would interview and offer an interview to the two top-ranked candidates, namely Dr. Lan and Dr. Morris. Does that sound okay? Do we have agreement on that proposal?
Yep.
Okay. Hearing no objections, we will offer interviews to them. So that then brings us to the question of, Peter and the next person down. So maybe we start with to make the decision more easier with candidate number 2, Dr. Dokuhaki Pune. Any comments from the committee on if this candidate should or should not be offered possibility to interview?
It's Tom. So as I review his CV, I don't see anything that looks like a postdoctoral fellowship training in laboratory immunology.
Okay, so I agree with that, so that at this point would disqualify him from the requirements. So that brings us then to Peter Elson. And I think given the aforementioned discussion, I think I tend to agree with raised, and I think I would put it to the committee that we should invite him for an interview. Give him the opportunity, and I think prior to that we will reach out to him and explain the nature of the request for an interview in the realm of where he's standing in, I don't want to say within the rankings, but what the perception of the committee is. Any thoughts on that?
I think you've got to be a little bit careful. I mean, if Paul's, is certainly the person we should be listening to in terms of the capacity of these people to do the job. And as things stand, Peter would need 2 years of training, I hear, to get him even close to the top two candidates. Is there a situation where we would offer that job to Peter? I mean, it doesn't sound to me like there is, frankly. If the top two turned us down, would you say, okay, well, let's take Peter, or would you say we've got to go back out and look again? I mean, maybe that's worth asking the committee, but I don't want to, he's a special case, Peter, obviously, and I don't want to get him off on the wrong foot in this setting. And I think to have a good discussion with him is a safer thing and probably fairer to him, who, he's been through a lot, God knows, you look at his CV. So I'm just kind of walking around on tiptoes a little bit. I think it'd be better if we just had a meeting with him and, in a way that kind of helped him along and was positive about he got this far, but we knew he didn't have the right formal training, and given the situation with Paul retiring and so on, blah blah blah, we just couldn't take didn't have the luxury of waiting for him to get his full ticket, and I can see ways we could have that discussion and yet help him with his presentation. And I don't know, I didn't read his CV for this application, but I know it from other settings. And I don't know. I just think we can't kid him along that he's close to getting the job, because he isn't. I just don't think that's the case. Anyway, I'd like to hear the committee's comments on that.
Well, I agree with you, Don, but the alternative of a formal sit-down and discussion, not just in the hall, I think he could benefit from. But you're right, not going to a formal interview would be appropriate based on what I've heard so far.
Well, I think there has to be a process for all candidates, and it's got to be the same process. You either offer an interview or you don't. And this isn't a remediation process that we're having for one person. I think, in fairness to everyone, if we offer someone an interview, it's also not with the precondition that we're required to offer a job to any of the people we interview. So, to me, the interview is actually the job interview. It's not a foregone conclusion that people that we interview that we're going to offer any of them the job. So I think we either offer people an interview or we don't. The concept of having a sidebar conversation with somebody about why they in particular didn't quite merit a full interview seems to be a little paternalistic.
Well, it is. That's exactly right. But in this case, I'm not sure it's inappropriate. Anyway, I would not call it a job interview for Peter if you're going to talk to him. And I wouldn't get the whole committee there firing questions. I'd just try to do it as maybe just Blake and I and maybe even Paul, just to talk to him and help him along. Anyway, I'm not voting anyway, so don't worry about what I'm saying.
Yeah, so Megan, do you want to make any
comments?
I
like Tom, I think we have to be very conscious of the process, and I'm surprised Adeline's not jumping up and down at the moment because, she kept reminding me of that every 5 seconds on the committee that I chaired, and I guess you do, if you don't treat all candidates in the same way, you open yourself up for complaints and problems, right, Adeline?
Took the microphone away from her, but she is jumping up and down. Do you want to come over here?
Yes, we do need to make sure that we have a fair process. So I think what all of you guys have discussed and thought about, keeping the process fair, asking yourself, are we doing this because he's a departmental member, or is it because he actually fits the criteria? Keeping in mind that we do have to look at this recruitment through the lens of the criteria and make sure that all candidates that we are considering do fit the criteria, and we're not just, giving an interview just because. Right? So
Paul,
keep that in mind.
Paul, what I wasn't sure of is, does Peter, he obviously has postdoctoral training in immunology, but is it laboratory immunology? Does he check that box or not?
What's listed on his CV in 1999 to 2001 is postdoctoral fellowship in brackets immunology at La Jolla.
But that was like playing with mouse model type thing. I'm not sure it's what Paul would think of as laboratory.
That's why I don't know.
Thanks. Yes, it is a pivotal question because he does have both formal training in laboratory immunology and also directed the laboratory, I believe, at Children's for several years. But the problem is it's not in transplantation immunology, and immunology is now a big field. So while he might meet the strict sort of letter of criteria as it was written, it's not the field of transplantation, and this is a transplantation laboratory, and that position would be directing this particular clinical aspect. So I see no way. I'm enormously sympathetic to Peter and would love to help, but I don't think that he would be able to step into this position as it stands now. He would have to start and retrain in transplantation immunology, would have to complete 2 years, acquire his ASHI certification before he would be really a candidate for the job. So I think maybe it was Don who asked the question, what would we do if the first 2 candidates turned us down? I think I would have to recommend to David that he reconvene the committee and re-advertise, because none of the other candidates are credible potentials for this position.
Yeah, I agree with you, Paul.
It's David. I agree as well. I think it's not conceivable that that Peter would be able to take on the job, in a time frame which is reasonable. With regards to how to approach him, let me give you a little context. I actually struggled with addiction myself, and many years ago was in crisis, and so I have a lot of sympathy for him. And what I needed was support. I think. Acknowledgement of my value as a person, and I think not a formal interview, and not in any way recognizing that that he's going to get this job, but the idea that we valued your application. We see merit in you. We would like to help you. Learn from this and move on. I think that's highly appropriate, especially since he is, a colleague and a member of, of this university. And I don't see that as being. I see that as being. Yeah, you said it was paternalistic, but I think it's appropriate. But I wouldn't confuse it with the fact that we're actually considering him for the job.
Thank you. No, I think this has been very good and important discussion. So what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, if we look at the pure factual numbers that are the ranking, he is 12 points below the next person, or 11.2 next person. We feel there's a concern that he would not be able to start the job the day after we offer it to him. So at this point, the committee feels that we will not extend an interview request to Dr. Van Elsen, and rather I will organize together with Don and other members of the search committee an informal meeting with Peter to relay to him as to why that decision has been made. Does that sound fair?
Yeah.
All right. So then I think we're done for right now, and we will try to get these interviews set up ASAP so we can move forward. Alan, do you want to add something?
So the next step is the interview process. And so what we'll need to decide as a committee are the same questions that we have to ask of both candidates. So I will circulate some questions for everyone to pick from and hopefully choose from. We should also decide as a committee how many questions we'd like to ask of each candidate. I think I've seen 8 on other committees, seen 5, some have picked 3. So it really just depends on what standard questions as a committee you'd like to ask. So that's something that we need to think about and decide upon, and then we will go from there.
So are we talking about a face-to-face?
Will be disconnected.
Are we talking about a face-to-face interview? They're going